Hello and welcome to the final lecture on period 9, and this one deals with foreign policy and key concept 9.3, the end of the Cold War and new challenges to U.S. leadership force the nation to redefine its foreign policy and role in the world. And we can subdivide this into two subcategories: in the 1980s and 1990s under Reagan, Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, and then since the year 2000 under Bush Jr. and Barack Obama. So for Reagan, Bush, and Clinton is ending the Cold War and then redefining America and the world. And for Bush and Obama, it's 9/11 and the war on terror and wars in Iran and Afghanistan. Now, here we see Ronald Reagan before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, one of the gates connecting East and West Berlin, and a major speech that he gave in 1987, and well remembered for his words there, where he looked into the camera and said to the Soviet leader, Gorbachev, he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And it was very much a high point of Reagan's presidency, and those words resonated extremely strongly with the people of Europe and in the United States. And for Reagan, he did very much promoted an intervention foreign policy of ending the Cold War and challenging the Soviet Union in all areas and sort of bringing them to their knees, so to speak. And many do cite him as being a key factor in ending the Cold War. Now, we'll answer that question in a moment. Now, his foreign policy, sometimes known as the Reagan Doctrine or the policy of rollback, in an explicit change away from simply containing communists where it is to actually trying to remove communist regimes in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And it's a very aggressive foreign policy. And he's going to challenge Soviet presence and assist anti-Soviet forces sort of everywhere. And for Reagan, coming out of the 1970s was a time of malaise, a very low morale in the American military, and the were coming across as very weak. They'd been kicked out of Vietnam, could not subjugate those people there. There was the Iranian hostage crisis of the 1970s. And Reagan very clearly, in his campaigns and in his language, said he wanted to reinvigorate America's purpose, the American military, beef it up, bring up the morale, and to challenge the Soviet Union. And he saw the world in good and evil, and, we're good, they're evil, and we're going to bring it to an end. So he's going to confront them as aggressive, expensive, and risky. There's the risk of nuclear war. And, I, as a child during this time, I could sense that and I could feel that, just as a little kid. And, having to have duck and cover practices at school and these kinds of things. And notable examples of where he's going to confront the Soviet Union: in Afghanistan, in Nicaragua, and in Angola. And this creates for strange bedfellows. Now, Reagan, his foreign policy, he said, "My idea of American policy towards the Soviet Union is simple," and some would say simplistic. It is this: we win, they lose. What do you think of that? Now, some of his strange bedfellows, left to right, that's the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, Contras in Nicaragua, and UNITA leader Jonas Savimbi of Angola. And the Mujahideen, American provided them with military support in terms of weapons. They were funneling weapons to them, particularly rockets that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Contras was a rebel group that was trying to oust a socialistic regime in Nicaragua and had very dubious human rights records. And in Angola, there was a civil war for power there between a Soviet-backed group and the other one, UNITA, that the Americans backed with weapons and training. And all three of them, their values are not the values of the American people. But the saying is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the enemy of my enemy does not always share my values. So those strange bedfellows. Now, the Cold War did come to an end shortly after Reagan's presidency. Now, did he end the Cold War, as some do cite? Well, yes, but mostly no. So, yes, the pressure he put on the Soviet Union was very much felt and caused problems. And, American support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, did call that a bleeding wound of Afghanistan as sort of the Soviet Union's Vietnam. And then the strong emotional rhetoric, tear down this wall, evil empire, the freedom fighters, which is what he called the Contras in Nicaragua. But no, There's numbers of factors that were involved, and much of the credit goes to the people in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union. And to say that it was Reagan is kind of an easy answer and ignores many of the other variables that helped bring down the end of the Soviet Union. So the Cold War is over, and Bush Sr. is in power, and then followed by Bill Clinton in the 1990s, and the establishment of a new world order. So what is America's role in the world now? And the vision is of a more cooperative, peaceful world and greater economic integration. You do see that in the 1990s, NAFTA, the Free Trade Agreement, APEC, the G7, G8 meetings. And the high point would be the coalition that repulsed Saddam Hussein's army from Kuwait in 1991. Saddam Hussein had annexed Kuwait, a neighboring country, and George Bush Sr. was able to put together a coalition of a number of countries to remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and to restore Kuwait's sovereignty. And, this idea of collective security, this is what, the League of Nations was supposed to work in this way. And it did work in this way. And then they imposed sanctions on Saddam Hussein to further weaken him. And we see it, working in other areas as well. For example, in the Balkans in the 1990s, when Bill Clinton was president, there were nationalistic civil wars going on as the Yugoslavia fell apart, and there was acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing, and American air support was able to, along with others, to bring a peace to the region. But in Somalia and Africa, they found sort of the limitations. Somalia, a failed state in Eastern Africa. Bill Clinton was hoping to provide security and protection, law and order, so that economic development could then follow in Africa. But an American Black Hawk helicopter was shot down in Somalia. Dead American soldiers were dragged through the streets and paraded through the streets, and this was shown on live television, and it made Americans sick to the stomach. So when genocide broke out in Rwanda between two ethnic groups, Hutsis and Tutsis, there was no willingness on the part of the United States or on Europe to put boots on the ground to protect one group from the other. And there were American soldiers sent in, but they were there just to help Americans get out of the country, same for other European countries as well. And over 500,000 people were killed because of the limitations of American willingness to get involved in these sort of places. And in all, the 1990s foreign policy is a vaguely defined period of American foreign policy, but a clear period emerges in 9/11, in the September 11th, 2001 attacks, which brings us to our last sort of major subpoint. And as it says there, following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, which I remember quite clearly, U.S. foreign policy efforts focused on fighting terrorism around the world. And what were the motivations for the attacks? Why did Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden do these attacks? Well, they said first, the presence of U.S. military in sacred ground in Saudi Arabia, U.S. support for Israel, which Al-Qaeda and extreme Muslims absolutely abhor the state of Israel, and the economic sanctions that had been imposed on Iraq. And these were the stated motivations for the attacks. And in the wake of the attacks, there was very quickly there was a NATO-led war in Afghanistan, which had broad support, and a very controversial war a couple of years later when they went to war in Iraq. And winning the war but losing the peace, Saddam Hussein is very quickly removed from power, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. But what fills that? Who's going to rule now? And it's created power vacuums that are still, not being resolved today. And they really made a lot of mistakes, particularly in Iraq. And they lost much goodwill that they'd gained from the 9/11 attacks. And then this war on terrorism has also caused a lot of controversy within the United States of what level of security is, and, security versus civil liberties. And Patriot Act was passed shortly after the 9/11 attacks, and this gave the executive branch significant powers to spy, monitor, detain Americans in the name of fighting terrorism. And it's got a lot of critics who say it's unconstitutional, and they point particularly to the Fourth Amendment, which is supposed to provide privacy. Police cannot just sort of spy on you, come into your home, search your bags without proper suspicion. And they say this is being violated, and then the due process of law is also being violated as well. access to lawyers, these sort of things. And the Transportation and Safety Administration set up, for more screenings at airports and border control, and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Agency, the NSA, taking on much broader powers as well. And with oil, as oil being one reason why many Americans criticize the war in Iraq, saying it's just to grab their oil. Now, oil is a very hot-button issue in American political landscape. And in general, and these are very general positions of Republicans and Democrats of what to do about oil, with Republicans saying, let's not rely so much on oil from elsewhere, and we should increase production within North America, the United States, Alaska, and Canadian oil. And Democrats saying, no, the answer, the solution is less consumption, encouraging reduction in oil consumption, and seeking alternative energy sources and conservation. And this brings us to our very final sort of point. Despite economic and foreign policy challenges, the United States continued as the world's leading superpower in the 21st century, which is true. They are the world's leading superpower at this time. And some people, though, looking at the United States and saying they're in a period of decline and falling apart. Politics is very fractious and partisan at this point, and with major economic problems, particularly inequality. And so comparing it to the fall of Rome, and that it's in a period of decline, and that is this is going to be the scenes. This is a painting of the fall of Rome. And then others saying, no, America is going to innovate, it's going to find its way and find solutions and reinvigorate itself and continue to lead the world, and that the future of the world is, the image of this. And we'll have to wait and see. All right, thank you very much.